bitter battles till the final ballot.
I'm going all the way.
We are beating Hillary
Clinton. A political revolution.
America has never stopped being great.
The struggle for the nomination turns to time-worn traditions, shadow operations for the last uncommitted delegates.
We ended up with 1180 tonight.
We researched them in detail. We knew who they talked to. We knew who they slept with. We knew who turned them on. We knew who turned them off.
Pat Boone, Jimmy Stewart came and met with the delegation.
The delegates are all that matters.
The Mississippians have been extravagantly courted and flattered by both Ford and Reagan. Everything but flowers and candy.
The nomination process is decided not by primaries. It's decided by those delegates at the convention.
And political conventions with a history of confusion
police clearing off the sidewalk
and chaos.
Turmoil, tension, angst. There were rumors every day of assassination is going to happen, blowing up this or disrupting that.
Glassware was being thrown down from the upper floors and hitting people below. It was just chaotic. It was terrible. Tear gas on top of it.
We started to chant, "The whole world is watching."
Now, with the whole world again watching, whose votes really count?
It is a strange way to pick a presidential candidate to run the United States of America.
I'm a constitutional conservative.
I'm an Army veteran with 2 overseas deployments.
I'm a lifelong Republican.
I am a recovering Democrat.
I'm tall. I got a silly hat on, okay?
I am for religious liberty.
I am pro-Second Amendment.
And it's as big as Howard. I'm going to work for you.
Send me to Cleveland to represent us properly.
Our party needs more young people to be the face of the party at the convention, right?
And see that our nation was endowed by our Creator.
I'm running unpledged.
I'm unpledged.
I don't want to take marching orders from anyone.
I hear the bugle call to go forward to the National Convention.
These folks are competing in an under-the-radar campaign for what might be one of the most powerful positions in American politics today, delegate to the Republican National Convention. This meeting in a Denver church is just one of many in cities and towns across the country.
I'm battle-tested, I've been to war, and I want to be your delegate.
Millions of Americans have gone to the polls in the past several months to vote for a candidate. But it's the party's delegates that will ultimately decide at their respective national conventions this summer.
And this is where we get a little confused because the primaries are so public, but the nomination process is a party process.
Many people think just because I go and vote for somebody, therefore that person becomes the nominee of the party. This is a long process set by rules of the party for the party to pick a nominee party.
Party rules dictate how delegates are allocated.
The Democratic Party has been more comfortable with centralized decision-making in Washington. So the Democrats have a more standard set of rules that they impose on all the state parties.
In Republican Party politics, they try to allow the states to make all the decisions that they can. They don't like Washington top-down, here's how you have to do stuff.
The result is a patchwork of ever-changing rules that will likely be the center of controversy. Even the most seasoned political observers acknowledge that they are convoluted.
We're dealing with a humongous number of different laws and party rules from 50 states.
Very complex. It's sort of like the IRS tax code.
It would almost have to be designed at an insane asylum for crazy people to follow.
It is a strange way to pick a presidential candidate to run the United States of America.
It's confusing, because it is confusing.
Well, it's a bad system, but I don't have any better ideas.
Most delegates are bound to vote for the candidate who won their state or district. But that's not entirely the case, as Donald Trump recently learned in Louisiana.
Even though I won, I get less delegates than the guy that doesn't win. You think that's fair? I mean, it's very simple. I got the most votes, and I didn't get the most delegates, right?
Fair or not, the rules in a number of states seem to defy logic. In Pennsylvania, after submitting $25 and 250 signatures, Cameron, Marianne, and Mike are all set to be unbound delegates. That means they can vote for whoever they want.
We're going to go to the convention as uncommitted delegates, and we have the tremendous responsibility of determining who will be the best candidate to not only represent the Republican Party, but the responsibility to win in November and become the leader of the free world.
Number one, I want to see how the statewide results go. I want to see how the district votes. And I have, of course, my own personal preference, and I need to weigh all of those issues.
The bulk of Pennsylvania's Republican delegates are unbound regardless of who wins the state's GOP primary.
What is the connection between the popular vote and what a delegate does? Based on the way that it is structured, and we didn't create the rules, but based on the way that Pennsylvania selects its delegates, there really is no connection.
The disconnect comes from rules that have roots in the era of party bosses and smoke-filled rooms, an era that produced the candidacies of Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt. Over the past few decades, the rules haven't significantly affected the outcome because primaries have produced a clear winner with a majority of delegates, and the conventions were essentially coronations. But with the Republican race up in the air, 2016 is likely to be the opposite, a contested convention, with delegates switching sides and strategically changing the rules.
There's a rules committee, there's a platform committee, there is a credentials committee that decides disputes about who actually is a delegate from X or Y state. If you can get your people on those committees, then that may be just as important as how many delegates you won.
Those delegates sitting in Cleveland's Quicken Arena this July will control who can be on the ballot. Will it be just Donald Trump? Will it be Trump and Ted Cruz? What about John Kasich? Will Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan even be considered? It'll be up to people like Cameron, Mike, and Marianne.
I'm approaching this with humility, confidence, and a little bit of excitement.
I take this very seriously, that we need to do our jobs to continue to vet the candidates.
This is one of those things that every delegate can make a difference.
Coming up, a few delegates change their minds and alter the course of history.
I am not a part of the Washington establishment, and maybe that is the best reason I have.
Lion Ted Cruz. We call him Lion Ted Cruz for a reason.
Nominating Donald Trump would be a train wreck.
It's great to be an adult in the room, an adult on the debate stage, huh?
This year, the Republican presidential candidates are on a collision course that could result in a hotly contested convention, the first since a historic battle 40 years ago.
It's the first time in American history that we have a president whom we didn't vote for, either as vice president or as president.
July 4th, 1976, America's bicentennial. Its 200th birthday. Amid the celebrations, the rocket's red glare, a limping nation is struggling to restore its pride in a decade rocked by war, 12% inflation, economic dislocation, and of course, Watergate.
Mr. Vice President, are you prepared to take the oath of office as President of the United States?
I am, sir.
Gerald R. Ford, Nixon's successor, became the accidental president. Ford had been House Minority Leader when Nixon appointed him Vice President after Spiro Agnew, his original Vice President, was forced from office for tax evasion.
The Republican Party was utterly, completely decimated. It's so bad that as of 1976, the Republican Party only controls one state house and one governorship. That's Kansas. That's how bad it was.
The world is ever conscious of what Americans are doing.
And so in 1976, just over a year into his term, the unelected president is running to win the office on his own. But unlike most sitting presidents, he faces a fierce fight in his own party.
He never asked for the votes of anybody outside of one congressional district in Michigan. So he has very little hold over the American people, and even in a way less so over the Republican Party.
Enter a fearsome challenger, Ronald Reagan, the charismatic ex-movie star, two-term governor of California, and a staunch conservative running as a Washington outsider.
I am not a part of the Washington establishment, and maybe that is the best reason I have for asking your support.
Reagan was an incredibly popular governor of California, two-term governor of California. Everybody expected Reagan to be a very strong challenger.
We're on the right side on the issues.
I liked Mr. Ford, but I really didn't think he could win a national election. And so we ran against Mr. Ford for the nomination that year, which normally you don't do for an incumbent president, but nobody had ever voted for Mr. Ford, which gave us the opportunity to do that.
Good luck, Governor. Thank you.
All of us on the Ford team knew that Governor Reagan was a formidable politician, a formidable force that had substantial support from the grassroots of the Republican Party.
February 1976, New Hampshire, the nation's first primary. The president comes in as the front-runner, but Reagan brings his sunny California charm to the frigid Northeast.
The welcome has been very warm.
The results are a surprise.
The closest presidential primary ever held in New Hampshire is over, and Gerald R. Ford has won by a whisker.
It's a moral victory for Reagan, a champagne moment.
Yes, I thought that I could do the symbolic thing this morning.
But the bubbles don't last long. Over the next month, Ford puts together a string of lopsided victories.
I think most people were surprised when Ford won so much at the beginning. We've been going for weeks, and Reagan had not won anywhere.
The question was asked over and over again in Illinois last week, why is Ronnie still running? There won't be any folding of my tent and slipping away. I'm in this all the way to Kansas City.
But as the primaries head down to North Carolina and the more conservative South, the tide begins to turn.
In New Hampshire, in Florida, in Illinois, we never expected to win. We knew those were not our strong territories.
You're not going to let me stop that long because we're running so late.
Reagan, all but counted out, comes roaring back.
Following his close win in yesterday's Indiana primary and his runaway victories in Georgia and Alabama, Reagan is ahead in actual pledged delegates for the first time.
It's a horse race now, and the two candidates need to scrap for every vote, especially uncommitted delegates, the ones who don't publicly disclose their choices until the convention. By summer, all Republican eyes are turning to Mississippi, an uncommitted delegation with what they call the unit rule.
We had 30 delegates. The state convention had elected them and ordered them to be uncommitted, but importantly, to all vote together. They bound them under the unit rule that everybody will vote the same as the majority of the delegation instructs them to.
30 crucial votes in a majority-takes-all contest to get the state's uncommitted delegates.
You had the Reagan camp and the Ford camp, and then you had these 6 or 8 people here that nobody knew what they were going to do, and they were the ones that really were going to decide what happened.
Doug Shanks was Ford's Mississippi point man, pushing for uncommitted delegates in a predominantly Reagan state.
Certainly there are some people that have been uncommitted and truly uncommitted that are making up their minds now, but the president has had substantial support in this delegation since the state convention.
Clark Reed was Mississippi delegation chairman. Billy Munger was chairman for Reagan. Haley Barbour was the delegation's chief of staff. In 1976, they are among the most influential Republicans in the state, Reagan supporters all, with considerable sway over the delegation.
We were uncommitted, and you were not supposed to be committed to anybody, but obviously I was.
I was for Reagan. Glad about it.
Even though I was for Reagan, and most everybody knew I was for Reagan, my job was to be neutral.
They're all country club guys, well-heeled, good guys, but they were the Republican Party.
Are you not starting to put the heat on?
Early on, Shanks has only 6 Ford delegates and a steep climb to move uncommitted voters over to gain a Ford majority. And under the unit rule, capture all 30 votes.
We got a photographer here?
Coming up, a campaign bombshell.
I said, what in the world? How can this be?
Well, I didn't see it coming. I had
July 1976. With the convention just 3 weeks away, President Gerald Ford is hanging on to his lead against the Ronald Reagan insurgency for the Republican nomination. Reagan's Southern support's holding, but he desperately needs Northern delegates or it is all over. He makes a risky, unprecedented move.
Good evening. The news tonight begins with a big surprise. Ronald Reagan says he wants Senator Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania as his running mate if he gets the Republican presidential nomination.
Richard Schweiker is as liberal as a Republican can be, but Reagan's campaign manager, John Sears, needs to broaden the candidate's base.
Schweiker was very good for this reason. He changed Reagan's image from being a hard right-winger to being somebody who would not only tolerate, but be happy to have the left wing of the party in.
Maybe so, but his conservative Mississippi delegates like Clark Reed are thunderstruck.
I said, what in the world? How can this be? I mean, surely he'll take him down. I mean, I waited 2 or 3 days. I said, surely he'll put his name down when he sees what he's done.
Well, I didn't see it coming. I had no idea that they were going to do it, and I did not think it was helpful. If Reagan were president and Schweiker has succeeded him, they weren't comfortable that Schweiker would be like Reagan.
Schweiker can bring Pennsylvania's badly needed 98 delegates, most of whom are leaning to Ford.
What he does is that he keeps Reagan's campaign alive until Kansas City, until he can figure out how to win the nomination there. So picking Richard Schweiker was a brilliant stroke.
3 days after Reagan's Schweiker announcement, the president and First Lady, Betty Ford, come down to Mississippi to reel in its uncommitted delegates. The presidential seduction begins.
All of a sudden, we got presidents and presidential candidates coming to visit, and it was an exciting time and was a good time for the state.
We did extensive research that told us everything we needed to know about those delegates. We knew who they talked to, we knew who they slept with, we knew who turned them on, we knew who turned them off, we knew everything about their background, we knew what organizations they belonged to.
Betty Ford would call our delegates and ask them to vote for her husband. You would get senators and governors and others, cabinet members, that would literally make phone calls to some housewife in North Mississippi. There were people invited to events at the White House. That's pretty heady stuff for somebody from Yazoo City, Mississippi.
Unbeknown to me, they had invited Clark Reed up to a state dinner for Queen Elizabeth.
August 5th, it's Reagan and Schweiker's turn. They roll into Jackson to reassure Mississippi delegates that Reagan has not abandoned the conservative faithful.
Well, I think I showed them I didn't have horns. Beyond that, I think we got some great opportunities there, and I believe that Mississippi is going to stay with Governor Reagan, and I'm encouraged.
Pat Boone came to Mississippi. Jimmy Stewart came and met with the delegation in Kansas City. There was a Hollywood aura around Ronald Reagan for good reason.
Sunday, August 15th. With 1 day to go before the convention, thousands of delegates and politicians swarm into Kansas City.
God bless you all, and the convention gets underway tomorrow.
Ronald Reagan, shortly after he arrived in Kansas City today for the convention, still hoping to come from behind and win. Our delegate count shows he has 1,036 and still needs 94 to get the 1,130 needed to win. It could turn out the Mississippi delegation is decisive because it includes the single largest group of delegates still undecided.
We were under a microscope, every one of us in a Mississippi delegation. I mean, you couldn't say anything without somebody on the national press, AP, New York Times, picking up. So we were in a fishbowl.
The Ford people went to the Mississippi delegation, and they said, you can be a kingmaker. You can make Jerry Ford the President of the United States, and he will not forget that.
Monday, August 16th. The convention is finally called to order. The heat is on.
Everything was quite electric because nobody knew who the party's nominee was going to be. And there were a lot of balls in play. There were a lot of uncommitted delegates. There was a lot of pilfering of delegates.
Reagan-Schweiker strategy has failed to close the deal. Pennsylvania is sticking with Ford. Time's running out on the Reagan campaign. In a desperation move, his campaign manager, John Sears, goes to the Rules Committee with a last-ditch effort to save the nomination.
The Reagan forces introduced a resolution which would have required Ford to name his vice presidential nominee before the balloting for president took place. And they figured whoever he named, there would be people that would get mad because that person was not their choice.
Back at their hotel, Mississippi delegates caucus over the rule change that would force Ford to name his vice president. The nomination itself is on the line. Each side digs in for a brutal battle that will tear the delegation apart.
So many people changed their word. Some people that looked me right in the eye.
It was just awful how they, at that point, they knew they were beat, but they had to have their say, and it was always very personal and very ugly. And even to our spouses, you know, I mean, just really ugly.
People that were very, very good friends have not spoken to each other, I suspect, or hardly spoken to each other in the 40 years because this was so contentious.
By a 3-vote margin, the Mississippi delegates oppose the Reagan amendment, which by unit rule turns into all 30 of their votes.
Voting on the amendment.
The next day, Tuesday, the Reagan resolution to force Ford to name a vice president goes down to defeat.
Contrary, nay.
It turned out that that vote was really the Reagan-Ford vote, and that was the night that the election was sealed.
The long and nasty fight is over. It is Gerald Ford for president. But it's Ronald Reagan who gets the last word, and Ford calls him down to the podium.
We must go forth from here united, determined that what a great general said a few years ago is true. There is no substitute for victory. Mr. President.
When he made the speech, it was by then too late. Jerry Ford had the nomination, but a lot of people walked out of there saying, I think we nominated the wrong guy.
In November, Democrat Jimmy Carter takes the White House from Gerald Ford, a bitter Republican loss. The Reagan Revolution that began in the '76 campaign transformed the Republican Party. 40 years on, another assault on the party's status quo threatens to tear the party apart in 2016's explosive race for delegates.
You know, that's not what politics is.
The establishment was threatened in '76 and '80. The establishment is threatened in 2016. The establishment reacted in a certain way in '76 and '80. The establishment reacts a certain way again in 2016.
They don't fill the rooms with smoke anymore, except metaphorically, but there'll be metaphorically smoke-filled rooms in Cleveland.
Coming up.
There were rumors every day of assassinations going to happen, or poisoning the water system of the city, or, you know, blowing up this.
History has a way of repeating itself. And this caustic and unpredictable political season is hardly the nation's first. If the 1976 Republican Convention was about the power of persuading delegates, the 1968 Democratic Convention marked the end of the establishment's iron rule. American democracy is volatile, and not without violence. And 1968 is now iconic testimony. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination sets the country aflame. By late summer, 27,000 American soldiers had died overseas, and the Vietnam War is the great divide in American politics.
About halfway through 1968, I wondered whether the American system would survive. I really did. I thought that we were not at a revolt stage, but people would abandon the idea of how we chose our presidents.
As nearly 100,000 people march in Washington demanding an end to the war, there's a growing call in the Democratic Party for an anti-war candidate. In a bold move, a poet from Minnesota, Senator Eugene McCarthy, answers that call.
People used to say McCarthy didn't seem like he really wanted the presidency.
That was his style.
Nice to meet you.
People used to ask him if he would be a good president. He used to say, I think I'd be adequate. But that was Eugene McCarthy.
He volunteers for Senator McCarthy. Yeah.
McCarthy's campaign is a grassroots effort, fueled by young volunteers, and they focus on making a dent in the New Hampshire primary against President Lyndon Johnson.
He said, I'll be lucky if I get 5 to 10% against an incumbent president. Well, he got 42%. So it just blew the headlines all over the country.
By then, Johnson's handling of the war has plummeted his approval rating. Sensing the country's turning against him, he makes a shocking announcement.
And I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In his place, a reluctant vice president, Hubert Humphrey, steps in to take the establishment torch.
Frankly, he was leaning against running. Humphrey had this instinctual feeling that bad things were going to keep happening and he was going to be engulfed.
My candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Humphrey's joined in the ring by Robert F. Kennedy, who begins challenging McCarthy for the anti-war platform, winning 4 primaries to McCarthy's 6. But the dream to see another Kennedy in the White House would end in the month of June, with Bobby Kennedy's assassination the night of the California primary. Less than 3 months later, still reeling, the Democrats meet in Chicago for the convention.
There was an enormous energy and anger. And so the context of those 4 days in Chicago, you can't really appreciate it and understand it without putting it in the context of what was going on in the world.
At 20 years old, Bill Daley has a front row seat to the convention at the side of his dad, Mayor Richard Daley.
There were rumors every day of assassinations going to happen, or poisoning the water system of the city, or, blowing up this or disrupting that.
Chicago is still smoldering from the riots following the King assassination. Entire neighborhoods have burned, causing more than $10 million in damage. And with massive protests planned for the convention, Daley is taking no chances with the anti-war movement.
Richard Daley came out, and when we said we were going to bring 500,000 people to protest the war, he just looked at the First Amendment and threw it out the window. We had no right to assemble and no right to petition the government.
Daley denies all permits to gather in protest.
Daley was, after all, the kingpin of the last political machine dynasty in the United States. And the idea that you were going to disrupt in any way his city, there was no place for discussion,
Supported by the National Guard, the Chicago police force is staffed around the clock. And Daley opens the convention with a clear message.
There's no person, any place, anywhere, or any thousands of them that will come to Chicago and take over our streets, our convention, or our city.
As the convention gets off the ground, it's clear that Hubert Humphrey is the frontrunner, even though he hadn't competed in a single primary.
For more than 100 years in American politics, primaries didn't matter. What mattered were the inside politics of every state's political party.
And back in '68, the delegates arrive at the convention unbound.
They were all free agents. They were only bound to the extent that they had been chosen by a powerful person in their state.
But that powerful person held all the cards.
The old days, the open convention really meant where the delegates are picked by the bosses and they make all the decisions, so it was anything but open.
Even Humphrey, the favorite son, is not his own man.
Lyndon Johnson, make no mistake, was in control of that convention. His shadow was everywhere, and Hubert knew that, and we knew that Hubert knew that.
When we arrived in Chicago, we found a team of Johnson's staff there. And they made it known that they were going to run things, and that, in fact, Johnson might even change his mind and run himself if Humphrey got out of bounds. It was very, very sour.
I don't believe that this is the democratic process.
The acrimony is just as bad on the convention floor, where the delegates are divided and demoralized.
Check with our state chairman. He's an elected delegate.
It was a running wrestling match, and it was a political, cultural clash between the past, the present, and what the future was going to look like.
The convention itself was the Wild West. You weren't quite sure who was on your side and who was not, and there were shoot-ups everywhere, and you just had to be on your toes.
The killing had to stop.
The key vote on the floor is the so-called peace plank, the vote to end the Vietnam War, and the debate is heated.
It was more angry, shouting back and forth, Johnson here and the peace forces there, and there was a lot of anger and shouting.
Out in the streets, anger is also brewing. On the first night of the convention, police clash with protesters after curfew.
I saw people sitting on their porch in the north side of Chicago literally pulled off their porch by police and beaten senselessly.
Right out of the aisle here. It's a terrific crush.
By midweek, tensions on the convention floor are boiling over.
2 votes yes, 49 votes no.
And then a decision on the peace vote.
The motion has failed.
The effort to end the war in Vietnam is shot down.
We had a peace plank agreed with Robert Kennedy's former supporters and McCarthy supporters, but Johnson intervened again in the platform committee, saw that that was defeated, and it was also defeated on the floor.
They have now begun to sing "We Shall Overcome," which is
in an act of protest. The peace delegates break out in song.
Are on their feet, and this is continuing.
And outside, as word spreads that peace lost on the convention floor, the violence is about to escalate. Coming up,
glassware was being thrown down from the upper floors and hitting people below, and it was just chaotic. It was terrible. I had never expected to see it.
Chicago's 1968 Democratic Convention is one of the most volatile in modern history. At the heart of the conflict, the war in Vietnam. In the street, protesters clash with police. And on the convention floor, it is the anti-war candidate, Eugene McCarthy, up against Vice President Hubert Humphrey and the Democratic establishment. As the convention nears its end, the McCarthy supporters lose the vote for peace. That day in nearby Grant Park, nearly 15,000 protesters are gathered. And as news of the failed effort to end the war spreads, the crowd becomes defiant.
The flag was lowered to half-mast by a teenager who thought it was a sign of international distress. He was arrested, beaten. The crowd was beaten. And then at that point, people were upset. Some people were throwing things.
The police move in on the crowd.
Everyone move back.
I got on the bullhorn and said, yes, we're kind of contained here, and we have a permit, so it would help us, everybody, if we just pull back. And then they charged again.
The situation deteriorates. Davis is beaten unconscious and ends up with 13 stitches in his head.
The tape you're about to see was made about 30 to 40 minutes ago.
The networks begin cutting away from the convention floor to broadcast the rioting outside.
When you look back on it, the Chicago cops, many of them were World War II veterans. A lot of them probably had sons in Vietnam, and they were just up to the point, and they'd had things thrown at them, big, heavy ashtrays, and kids were throwing feces at the cops as well. So it was a perfect prescription for the kind of riotous environment that was created there.
The violence horrifies many party members, and as the nomination speeches get underway, they voice their outrage.
We wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Enraged, Daley fires back.
Daley went nuts. Remember, Ribbentrop said it's so hard for some people to accept the truth, or something to that effect. That was traumatic and almost chaotic.
Amidst the tension, the vote for the Democratic nominee gets underway. To no one's surprise, Humphrey wins the nomination with 1,761 delegates to McCarthy's 601.
The anti-war people wanted to get delegates to the '68 convention who were opposed to the war, and they couldn't break it. They couldn't get into the system.
May we once again say thank you, thank you.
But even with the win, Humphrey seems to have little cause to celebrate.
The night that he was nominated, we had a small occasion in his suite in the Hilton, and it was like a wake. I mean, the man had just been nominated for president, and we were all demoralized.
As night falls, thousands of protesters gather in front of the Hilton Hotel where the delegates are staying.
There were a large crowd on Michigan Avenue, and the police contained them. They used motorcycles, they built a human perimeter, and then they started to push.
Chaos unfolds in front of the cameras.
It was not a pretty scene. It was like, a bad accident. Kids were crying and furious and everything else.
Glassware was being thrown down from the upper floors and hitting people below, and it was just chaotic. It was terrible. Tear gas on top of it. I had never expected to see it in a party convention.
The whole world is watching becomes the protesters' defiant refrain.
We thought, well, everybody will see this and they'll understand we're not the perpetrators, the police are. Well, before too long, we learned that wasn't true. The majority of them went with the cops.
I went home to South Dakota. My dad was a dirt road Democrat, and I thought he would be sympathetic to the young demonstrators. And we had a huge argument that night. And before it was all over, I began to understand more clearly what the tenor of the country was, because my father hated the idea of these kids using expletives, raising the middle finger in front of the cameras. It was not just his idea about how America should operate.
Much of America agreed. In November of 1968, Richard Nixon wins the presidency, running on a platform of law and order. The Democratic Party emerges from the convention battered, bruised, and divided.
We were bitter. A lot of bitter feeling after the convention. Certainly there was among the McCarthy people. We had tried hard to work within the system, and still we got screwed by the system.
The violence of that summer is later characterized in a report as a police riot, and many lay the blame at the feet of Mayor Daley.
He became the symbol in many people's minds as the representative of the establishment. So obviously we were very defensive of my father. We knew him, we knew what kind of person he was, and knew how much he also had dedicated his life to the Democratic Party.
But the era of the Democratic establishment's iron rule has come to a close, and the system is forever changed.
68 had a big impact on the Democratic Party because they reformed the rules. The delegates had to be representative of the states, and you had more minorities, more women, more people from the ground up.
Primaries become the way of creating inclusion, and they explode from 15 in 1968 to more than 40 today.
The second thing that happened was they said primaries must be binding on the delegates. In other words, if somebody wins the primary, they got to win the delegates.
Caucuses are to be well publicized and open to everyone.
At the time, each one of these things was just an effort to be sure that the anti-war protesters who were cut out in '68, that people like them weren't cut out. I don't think anybody really anticipated how completely it would change the way we nominate presidents.
But while the 1968 reforms may have reset the system, nominating our president continues to be a process that is subject to change.
Our leaders for not knowing what the hell they're doing.
We're angry because we've been lied to.
People have a right and a reason to be angry.
I think the people of this country are ready for a political revolution.
There's a lot of anger today in the country, as there was in 1968. A lot of turmoil going on. You had enormous change socially, culturally in our country at the time. Now you have enormous economic change that's causing social, cultural change in our country.
The result is a deep divide in both parties. In this year's close Democratic race, we could see their version of unbound delegates, called superdelegates, choosing the nominee. Superdelegates are elected officials and national committee members like Elaine Kmark.
We have a kind of hybrid system. Half of it looks public, but much of it is an internal party process. And that's a result of the old system and the new system coming together. That happened between 68 and 72.
While both parties have a hybrid system, it's the Republican convention that's likely to be contested. And at a contested convention, control ultimately lies with the delegates and party leaders.
The power brokers, the political elite, those that want that manipulated outcome, they always have a goal in mind. You know, they always have a candidate or candidates that they support more than others.
The thing is so tightly controlled that the average person who thinks he's going to come in and participate in it gets overwhelmed.
One means of control is the convention rules, some of which are rewritten by a select group of delegates just a week before the gavel comes down.
Rules can be changed all the time. There's nothing wrong with changing rules. How they're changed, why they're changed, that's where the problem comes in.
Any change could benefit one candidate over another. And if no candidate has a majority of delegates on the first ballot, a contested convention will turn into a brokered one. At that point, most delegates are no longer bound. They're now free agents.
After first ballot, it's Katie bar the door. Anything can happen.
Candidates hope to stop their delegates from jumping ship.
If you want to be successful as a delegate chairman, delegate operations person for a campaign, your job is to try to win over the uncommitted delegates or the unbound delegates, steal delegates from the other candidates, and protect your own delegates.
And just like the Ford-Reagan fight in 1976, candidates risk what campaigns refer to as Trojan horses.
A Trojan horse delegate is a delegate who is elected nominally in a delegate slot awarded to one candidate, but whose heart is for another candidate, okay? And that is what the Trump campaign is nervous about right now.
They have reason to be nervous. Listen to what this Trump delegate told us.
In the second ballot, I'm going to have to support Ted Cruz. I want to vote for conservative.
A second ballot also opens the door to a white knight, someone who wasn't even in the race. For instance, someone like Mitt Romney or Paul Ryan.
Now, there's some folks in Washington that are having fevered dreams of a brokered convention, of the convention deadlocked, and then they march in with a white horse and have this Washington deal maker who didn't run, who wasn't elected by the people, but who saves the Washington establishment. That ain't going to happen. And if they tried that, you would see the voters revolt, quite rightly, after having all 50 states vote.
You're going to have a rough July at that convention. You better get going, and you better straighten out the system, because the people want their vote. The people want to vote, and they want to be represented properly.
Cleveland could make Chicago look like a walk in the park. Everything that's going on in America right now, insiders versus outsiders, economic conflict, political conflict, sociological conflict, everything's going to be concentrated right there.
While Cleveland is ordering riot gear and tightening security, violence isn't the only risk from a contested convention. The 1976 convention did little to unite the Republican Party, and Ford lost the general election. And the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago directly contributed to Humphrey's loss. Voters might not have the power to choose the nominee, but they still have the power to choose the president.